But in doing research about you and about the podcast, your fantasy days started long before 2015. It actually started in high school with a friend of yours named Jason Moore, and you guys were really into fantasy basketball. So tell me, and this might have been around the year 2000, 2001. So what was fantasy sports like back in those early days?
Yeah, that was high school. I was in a freshman Spanish class, and Jason is 2 years older than me, and somehow was in a freshman Spanish class. And so that's the only way that we ended up meeting was he was this boisterous junior stuffed in the class with a bunch of, uh, you know, quiet freshmen. And we ended up just sharing a friendship about basketball in general. Like we played basketball together a lot in high school. And then fantasy sports at that time, we played on a platform called Sandbox, which if you're not my age, you probably don't even remember. It predated a lot of the major platforms. And so we played fantasy basketball there and just fell in love with it. My first introduction to it was like seeing it in newspapers and my uncle would play, but it was like, people had to call on the phone to report scores. I mean, you're talking early days, but Sandbox was an online platform. And so we kind of bonded over, the days of fantasy basketball and Dikembe Mutombo era fantasy basketball. And so it's funny because like you talked about being in class and having that question for Jason, like Jason and I's relationship has a couple of moments where like being in a class, that's how we met and started playing fantasy basketball. It's also, we were in the middle of real estate classes when we started the Fantasy Footballers podcast, which, we didn't think was going to do what it did and figured there's no way people make money doing this. So we're going to have to do something to make money. And so, yeah, it's a couple of classroom moments certainly catalyzed the journey.
Even before starting the Fantasy Footballers, you had joined a company with Jason. So Jason started the company, and then you and another guy by the name of Mike Wright joined his company. I believe you were the COO of that company with Jason. And you guys were working in the tech scene. You guys were involved with MySpace, which is even pre my time, to be honest. I mean, I had a couple friends who had it, but I don't remember much about MySpace, to be honest with you. But I do remember Facebook games, and that's what you guys got into eventually with the company. So, if you remember Farmville, that was a big hit. And so you guys were doing a lot in the Facebook games kind of space. I'm curious, why leave tech and go pursue a podcast, especially back in 2015, where, if you were to tell an average Joe on the street, hey, do you listen to podcasts? They'd be like, what is that?
Yeah, it's wild because I think I just saw a stat the other day about like 18 to 34-year-olds. There's a higher percentage of them that listen to a podcast regularly than even watch regular television now. So you're talking about a huge leap in consumption over 9 years. What's funny is in both industries that I was a part of, both times I felt like we were late to that party. We thought we were late to the Facebook gaming party with the company that we were a part of, which is called Broken Bulb Studios, and we made Pokemon style game and city builders, and it was right in that heyday. But our distribution platform was Facebook, and so as acquisition changed and as advertising changed, our ability to acquire users changed. And so we had a startup that went from 30 plus employees to really struggling to make the transition into mobile gaming. And so when you ask why did we leave tech, it was kind of tech left us to a degree. The company had waned down from, I was there 8 years. As you said, I was the COO. I got started in tech doing front end graphic design and website design, CSS, that type of stuff. And, a lot of entrepreneurial side projects, just building sites for years. In those early days of just trying to hustle your way to some sort of entrepreneurship. And so it just happened to be at the simultaneous moment where like the company started to shrink up, and I knew I had to plan for the future. And we honestly, we had consumed podcasts in the fantasy football space for a long time, ESPN, CBS, the Football Guys, to name a few. And, we had long commutes to Scottsdale out here in Arizona. And So I'd listen to those shows all the time. I don't think we ever had a moment where we're like, hey, we can do it better. I think we had a moment where we said, hey, we just plain enjoy talking about fantasy, and we enjoy it so much. It was certainly a big part of the discussions at lunch tables during the tech days. And so it was like, we love this so much. People might enjoy kind of the camaraderie that the show was built around. And so, we just kind of spun that up. We really spun it up as a side thing for our league. And then Jason was listening to Mike and I and just said, hey, put that forward to the public. It'll be huge. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense. There is no huge podcast in this space. But we were dedicated to doing it year round, which was new. And there were other hungry year round listeners, I think, that really helped us get off the ground floor.
I'm curious when you guys started the podcast, because I think in another podcast you had said how you always had a passion for entrepreneurship. You love building businesses, but from a young age as well. And so when you first started the podcast alongside Mike and Jason, did you view it as a business from the start, or was it just it was something that, like you were mentioning, you kind of viewed as a side gig, and maybe it's fun, but I'm curious how seriously you took the podcast from the start.
Yeah, I mean, I think very seriously. I mean, that's something we really enjoy, especially Jason and myself, being kind of entrepreneurial at heart from the beginning. I mean, back in those high school days, literally my first like side gig or job I ever had was just being his like front end design guy for a web design business he had started. So like, we approached it as a business. We approached it using disciplines that we'd applied in other industries that we didn't think were being well applied in the podcasting space. Whether that was, SEO to the degree that we were utilizing it, or maybe some of the social media engagement, certainly the year-round schedule, some of the video that we committed to early, even when it wasn't lucrative early, we knew where the world was headed in terms of video. So yeah, it was a business from day one. We needed to still see what that market meant, whether that was to be, a side type of business, or whether that had the legs to become what it is today. And so that was going to be evaluated, but we knew that it had no shot of being either thing if we didn't put a lot of attention into it from day one. So yeah, we certainly approached it with the same kind of disciplines we felt like we knew, and just wanted to see where it could go.
I'm curious, back to the early days. You start the podcast, and I'm assuming you weren't monetizing right from the start. So correct me if I'm wrong, but you weren't monetizing from the start. And so what was that like in between phase like, where you leave tech and you're now starting this podcast you're not making any money? And I ask because the advice that I see, besides the fact that I'm an aspiring podcaster, the advice that I see all over Twitter and other social media is, hey, if you're going to start something, do it while you're working a 9 to 5, so you have some security and you have a safety blanket and you can pay the bills. And then eventually, once your side gig overtakes your 9 to 5 in terms of the amount of money that it's bringing in monthly, then it might be time to jump ship and go all in on this side project of yours. So all of that to say, early days, how did you view monetization, and how stressful was it not making any money from the pod?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's a good point. I think that obviously that would be a luxury for a lot of people if they had the ability to do, put the amount of effort needed to grow a business while simultaneously having the security. It doesn't always work out that way. Certain industries, I think, require a level of sacrifice and commitment that just by nature takes more time. And so that can be difficult. That's why we had the misfortune / fortune of kind of like seeing our current jobs disappear. But in those early days, we really had the mindset of buying months of survivability. And so what you referred to at the very beginning of this podcast, how you knew Jason from the beginning, was asking him a question, doing paid question and answer. Like, that was overwhelming for us to do. But at the time, it was it was something we were like, we got to manufacture a month's worth of revenue. We took our first podcast ad deal that we took from SeatGeek was negotiated on the basis of being paid up front. That is not traditional in podcasting. We normally, what you do is you book ads, and then maybe there's a 60-day lag, and then there's a 90-day or at least a 30-day time between invoicing. So you're talking 90 to 120 days from the time you might be doing ads to getting paid for it. So we knew that that wasn't going to work for a football podcast that needed to manufacture income in the beginning. So we made a deal that was very beneficial to the advertiser, but paid us up front. And we were willing to make that sacrifice to buy 2 months worth of existence, so to speak. And so, Patreon was something that was also a mechanism that, there goes one of my headphones. Patreon was a mechanism that we used because it was non-seasonal dependent. That was one of the questions we had in the beginning was, this is a football season that goes from August through December. We want to do it year round. How does that work? And so the monthly patronage and pledging and perks that come from, a stabilized monthly commitment from fans was something that helped steady the boat. So, I guess my advice additional advice to the people that would say, you want to try to spin it up on the side. I totally agree. But once you get that moment or that inkling that you have something that has a much higher ceiling than where you're at, I think that's when we made the full-time commitment. Is we knew early, because of the market, we knew what football and fantasy football's market was in scale. I know a lot of people that are podcasters, and they do a great job at podcasting. But that market of listenership is so small that there's no real way for me to make the logical leap from you get to do this thing that's your hobby and then turning that into monetization, because there are people that are very passionate about, I don't know, knitting stuffed animals, probably, right? And you might be the best podcaster on the planet in that space, but your market is so small that the idea of monetizing it is very difficult, or could be more difficult. So once we had an inkling that this thing had a huge ceiling, which, people have asked us for 9 years to do other podcasts and other sports. We have said no for 9 years because we still believe there's headroom in football. That's how big that market is. So it's really important to be realistic about what you're pursuing, I think, and whether that's just going to be a hobby or whether that's something that could be a full-time opportunity.